It is 7:13 a.m. on the second day of October. We're glad you're watching Morning Express. Remember our question of the day today: what are your thoughts on how the government communicated on the Westgate siege, during the Westgate siege? What are your thoughts? Quite a number of them coming in already. I want to sample just a few of your thoughts, and you can keep them coming at Sophia Wanuna, at KTN Kenya. Remember to use the hashtag Morning Express KTN. We have Benson Arudo saying, poor, very poor. It's like they're not educated on how to convey relevant information to the public in case of catastrophes. And then we have Jack Stephen Oruko saying, we were just played. Ramadan Muyika says, communication simply lost its definition. They should emulate the Kenya Red Cross. And I will continue to sample more of your comments as we continue with our discussion this morning. So keep them coming. 22155 is our SMS number at KTN Kenya, at Sophia Wanuna. The hashtag is Morning Express KTN. And this morning in studio, I'm joined by two very brilliant gentlemen. When it comes to matters communication, they will break it down and say it as it is. Paula Charles, speech coach, Jade Communication. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Sophia.
And Derrick Banga, MD, Public Image.
Delighted, Sophia. Glad to be here.
Thank you for coming in this morning. I'm going to start by asking you both, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate the communication from Saturday, unfortunate, the tragic Saturday, the 21st September, to the 4th day after the siege was concluded? What do you rate the communication during that time from the government, Derrick?
Well, I will probably give it a 4.5 to a 5, and I'm being generous here. There were things that were done well. There were a lot of things that were not done well, and I think that's what we're going to focus on, perhaps on some of the areas where they can improve, as a government can improve in terms of communicating during a national crisis like this.
4.5 to 5?
Well, I would give it 5.
I
would give it 5, and I would agree with Derrick that there were some things that were done good and others which were, bungled.
That's quite generous. I want us to begin by playing some of the clips we have. And of course, we heard from the president. He spoke the first day, Saturday, at about 11 p.m. Then he spoke again the next day alongside other national leaders. And of course, when the siege was, there was a resolution to it, we heard him speak again. And we saw quite a number of people coming out to applaud him and say that was a great speech. I don't know if you have that clip ready. Maybe my director can just let me know if it's ready to run, the president's speech. But when it's ready, we'll be running it. But when you heard the president and saw him speak, and first that he spoke at about 11, the siege had started unfolding from about midday, lunchtime, 1 o'clock. About the timing, was it too long before he spoke?
Well, I don't think so. I think in a national crisis like this, the terrorists on the loose, okay, they were in the mall. The president needs to, first of all, be appraised by the people on the ground about all the facts that are taking place, so that when he does appear on national TV, he is giving us information that is hopefully factual. So in terms of that, and again, I'm going to do a lot of comparing and contrasting with similar disasters that have happened, Mumbai, London, certainly 9/11. So I think in terms of when he appeared after the disaster had begun, or after the terrorists had struck, I don't think that there was anything wrong with that. I think where I would have sort of things to say is with the content of what he actually spoke about.
Okay. What do you think about the time?
No, I think it was appropriate. This was something that was dynamic, something that was evolving, and it would not have added any value for a president to go on early and give us information without the full facts in place. However, there were other public officials who were tasked with the responsibility of communicating at that particular time. And the verdict is still out there as to whether this public official stepped up and were able to effectively communicate. Now, I'd like also to mention the fact that this incident brought together a lot of patriots, and different patriots have different perspectives on how this issue was handled. And instead of what I've seen, some attacks going out on people who have probably proposed that this would have been handled a lot better, I think we need to realize that everyone, each one of us is a patriot, and each one of us had good intentions And we should use this as a teaching moment.
Okay.
I think it's important to raise that up so that criticism is not just unbridled criticism, but everyone has a right to offer a perspective. But the challenge also would be to whoever is analyzing this whole incident, not to just leave it at criticism. I would like us to try and elevate the level of our rhetoric to the perspective where we offer solutions. And I think we will try and address that from a communication perspective.
You know what Paul is talking about these the different stakeholders in a crisis like this. So you have the people who are immediately affected. Right. You have the wider general public. And then obviously in this day and age where there's 24/7 communication, you have people online. So any person who is responsible, and we're talking about the government officials here who first came up to now appraise us of the situation, need to know that they're speaking to these different audiences. And so the message needs to be able to address these different audiences. It needs to be nuanced. One of the things that I unfortunately did not see, certainly with the public officials who have been speaking on this crisis, is what I called marrying the heart and marrying the mind, where there is, you're giving us facts on how the operation is going, what has happened. That is the mind. But there is also this outpouring of an emotional intensity. The nation has been shaken to its core.
Right.
We clearly saw that.
Yes.
You have got to be able, as a spokesperson in an event like this, to also be able to speak to the hearts of people. And I think that was wanting in this case.
Did the president achieve that?
The president did what got the closest to achieving that.
How so?
When he spoke, he was able to speak to us. I mean, the very fact that he had relatives who were involved in this. Imagine if you had relatives who were involved in this, and you would be able to feel the emotion that he was feeling. To be able, even in terms of your, and it really is a performance when you're standing up there and you're speaking and you're talking to a nation which is having collective grief. It's about being able to touch people. Literally, the heart, touching the heart of the nation, using particular words, the content, saying, I know how you feel, using words like we. And those are some of the things that were lacking in certainly some of the officials, the official communication that came forward.
And we noticed something that after the incident, when the president went up to speak, the second day he was able to bring together all the former prime minister, the former deputy prime minister, and the symbolism of unity was, that was really powerful. It conveyed quite a lot of meaning. And you saw them speak as though they were reading from the same script, which was good. But after that, all hell broke loose with the other public officials who appeared not to have a clear strategy on how to communicate and how to disseminate information, which ultimately led people or the public to seek information from alternative sources, social media, Twitter, and it was a systemic failure in the communication mechanism, the crisis communication mechanism in the country. There was a clear gap, and perhaps before we could even lay blame on specific individuals or specific institutions, the question we need to ask ourselves is, did we have what we call a counter-terrorism communication strategy in place?
Okay, well, clearly, I don't know if that was put in place. We had just come off the backs of a recent disaster at the airport a couple of months ago. People have said, yes, this is a new government, we're still waiting for things to be put into place. But when when something like this strikes the core of the nation, there has to be, people that be able to look up and say, you know what, the people who are in charge, there is a definite strategy, certainly a strategy in terms of communication, strategy in terms of media, which I think was lacking. Also, here's a question. Did we have the right people speaking?
That's the thing, because it seems when you say the right people and whether they had a strategy, clearly they agreed they'd let the Cabinet Secretary Interior speak. And we heard him the first time address the nation, and the second time conflicting information. And what was very, every time he'd speak, what was very obvious and kept coming out is that people were left with still more questions than answers and more confused from before. So is it that the situation in itself, as it were, that Kenyans should understand, really it would be unfair to expect that he'd have every answer at that particular point as the situation is unfolding? Or was he a man, or was it an institution or a government unsure of itself and what's happening, even to communicate anything to the public?
Let's assume that there was a strategy in place. No, maybe there wasn't a strategy in place. Let's take the perspective that there may not have been a clear counter-terrorism communication strategy in place, and the absence of that created a vacuum, and which led to a crisis in itself. All officials, all competing agencies which were involved in this effort were striving to communicate, to say something without a coherent, coordinated, synchronized approach to disseminating messages. Now, I would believe that we needed, after having experienced attacks in this country of the first one in 1998, then we should have put in place a counter-terrorism communication strategy. We might want to ask ourselves, whenever terrorists attack, do they also think of communication? And the answer might be, yes, we saw them communicating effectively. We saw them on social media. We saw them on sending out videos online, posting those videos online. So a counter-terrorism communication strategy in place would have been appropriate to counter some of those messages that were being sent. And we'll talk about
that and what exactly that would be. That's kind of a communication strategy. But I want us to get into the specifics, Derrick, and look at some of the things that were said and then reversed later. Let's begin with what he talked about when there was the question of whether there were women involved in this particular attack. We'd had witnesses say they'd seen some women. So the first time he addresses the press on that particular issue, seated next to him are the other security chiefs, he said it's not something they can confirm at the moment. And then we see the General Karangi whispering to him on mic, it was heard, actually there are no women. We know there are no women, it's all men. And then he said it. So first, the fact that he was being informed of what to say live on camera, and then now he says, okay, it's not. And then a day later he comes and says, in actual fact, there may have been some women. The president also saying there may have been women. The cabinet secretary for Foreign Affairs as well saying the same thing.
You know, the people who are advising him, there are clearly some questions that were going to be asked of him. Certainly during that first interview that he did, were there women involved? How many attackers were involved? So what I would have advised him is that you either have the facts or you don't have them. If you don't have the facts, then it is okay to go on national TV and say we are still in the middle of this investigation, it's early days, we don't have the facts, rather than giving people information which then later turns out to be false. I'm reading a great book right now by Tony Blair. It's called My Journey. It's basically it's his memoir, and he talks about the worst situation for any politician or any public official to be is to be in a situation where you're being asked questions and you know those questions are coming and not having prepared for them. There's an easy way he could have answered that question. He could have simply said, we are still working to ascertain those facts.
Which he had done, but the general then whispers to him and we hear him saying
I think that goes to the heart of what we're talking about.
Right.
There was no synchronicity in terms of the crisis communication, where you have different people giving different bits of information. Either we know there was a woman involved, we know how many terrorists were involved, or we don't know. And we're working to get those facts. It's okay if we don't know, but at least let us know that, and rather than give us piecemeal or bits of information which later turn out to be untrue. Again, I'll take you back to this. September 11th, I actually happened to be in New York, and Rudy Giuliani handling a question as to how many people died when the towers collapsed. And he answered that question, I think, in one of the smartest ways, because obviously he didn't know how many people died. But he said something which, again, goes back to what I said earlier, touching the emotion of people. He said, the number of people caught up in this catastrophe is going to be too many for us to bear. Now that's, in my mind, a very astute way of answering a question like that. You don't know how many people actually were caught up in the disaster. You don't have those actual facts, but you are emotionally collecting the audience and you're telling the audience, you know what, brace yourselves because this number is going to be big, or there might be some bad news coming later.
Okay.
That's one way of handling it.
Right, and we heard him talk about the hostages. That question kept coming up, and then yesterday we saw body parts being recovered from there, and of course DNA test will be conducted. But he was very almost categorical that they were sure nobody had been left in there. So what does that make of the whole situation in terms of what he'd said and what's unfolding?
I think it takes us to the whole issue of trust. Do we now trust our officials? Our officials briefed adequately? My response to that is no. And could they have come up with a better strategy in handling the communication at that particular point? Perhaps they would have. We set up a command center, but we did not set up a communications command center. We needed to do that. And in essence, what we would have done is we would have brought all these stakeholders into a partnership, even with the media. The media at that particular time was in a dilemma to to say the truth, your fidelity to truth, but also patriotism, and whether the delicate question as to, are you propagating the terrorists' interests? So you're caught up in that particular situation. What would have been appropriate is through this communication command center, you bring all these people together as partners and come up with a clear command structure. Who is the head of this communication command center? Who is the designated spokesperson? How do we prepare them for prospective questions that the media is bound to raise? And how do we field those questions? Now, that would have been, that is a way we should have gone about it. Now, we didn't, clearly, we didn't do it that way and ended up, bungling it all the way. Now, people are not, if you go through the conversations on social media, that trust has been lost. And when trust has been lost, and especially on public officials, it also touches on their own individual credibility. It becomes extremely difficult to regain that credibility and that trust. And the public now will have to look for alternative sources of information. And we saw people getting information through social media. We live in the 24-hour news cycle where anybody with a smartphone standing outside Westgate taking pictures, tweeting, became a journalist. Whether they were saying the truth or not, it went around the world. Now, if we had, tying it in with the proposed communication command center, we would have countered those messages. You don't go on Twitter just to say, quoting one tweet, that we are not here to serve the terrorists pastries. You don't go on Twitter to say things like this when the terrorists are sending messages that are being retweeted by around the world. You clearly countered that with a strategy.
Okay.
Now, we lacked that.
And it's interesting that you bring out the aspect of tweeting, and we saw a lot of all those bodies and chiefs tweeting. And for me, what I found very interesting when we were on location was at times they'd say something like, we are now in control of 3 floors, the terrorists are cornered, they're in one corner. And to this point, and even as the whole siege was unfolding, they would say they have control of them all, the terrorists are in one corner, but have not captured them yet. And then later he talked about having killed 5, but to date we don't know where they are, their identities, or what happened. Are they alive? Did they flee? So still very many questions. The biggest thing is questions abound.
Exactly. And Paul talked about trust. Trust is the currency of the 21st century. It's about connecting with your audience emotionally, and especially in a crisis like this. Now, you know what, Sophia, as a disclaimer, hindsight vision is 2020. It's easy for us to sit here and say, should have done this, should have done that. But I think what we're trying to say here is that being prepared is probably one of the most important things that needs to be done in the eventuality of any crisis like this. So first of all, I think what this shows us is a lack of preparedness. But going to what you said about social media, here is another thing that we could have used, or certainly the government or the crisis communication could have used social media. Why don't you co-opt some of these very vociferous bloggers, the information that they're getting, whatever their sources are, co-opt them as part of your media strategy, as part of your crisis communication strategy, to have them tweet out messages that you want, perhaps to use the information that they may be getting from other sources that you're not privy to. So again, we need to wake up and realize that we are fighting certainly terrorism in the 21st century, and the social media, Paul talked about a 24-hour cycle. This is going to be part and parcel of it, and should be an integral part of any crisis communication.
Right, and some people have argued as well that when it came to communicating this information to the public, fine, Olelenku, the Interior Cabinet Secretary, was the man in charge in that particular point, but they should have let somebody else with an understanding of operations to give the brief, somebody who would, without giving too much to the public and compromising their operation in the mall, but help Kenyans understand this is where we are at, this is what we can tell you, and authoritatively, so that by virtue of the fact that people, it has come up again and again, he's from a hotel industry background, and so people looked at him as not an authority quite.
I wouldn't, go to that extent of judging an individual based on their career. I don't think that argument is neither here nor there. By the time you are a minister with that portfolio, you have access to a lot of information, and it's of the essence that you are prepared. We have seen in other parts of the world officials who necessarily are not veterans in the particular field that they're handling, but they've handled their communication and whatever crisis
but in this case, he did
adequately.
do a good job.
Now, I think that the issue here was preparation. I agree with you that maybe we could have deployed at some point somebody else who had the technical knowledge on security matters within the parameters of government, with a clear script guided by the crisis, counter-terrorism crisis communication strategy to communicate. That was one way of doing it. But the other way would have been to prepare adequately, give the cabinet secretary adequate briefs, prep him for those interviews, train him, go through the questions that map out prospective questions that would come up, and with a panel of experts give clear responses that would fit, that would be factual, that would be truthful, and that would also be able to connect. We saw at some point when the CS had a press conference, it seemed like a fact-relaying session. It lacked the human connection. And so you're watching, you're listening, but you're thinking, people are going through pain. People are hurting. People have lost loved ones. There's collective fear in the country. Who is reassuring us of our security? Who is acting as our comforter? Who is acting as the person to bring that healing? So
I think the president did some of that. But talking about the public official who was most in the limelight in terms of training, in terms of preparation, here is my question to you, Paul. Was he the best person for that job? Because if you talk to crisis communication experts or crisis management experts, they will tell you that sometimes the best person is not necessarily the leader or the head or the president. You need to find the person who is best able to emotionally connect with that audience, to be able to relay those facts. Remember, you're marrying the mind and you're marrying the heart, and you're still able to come out credible, you're still able to come out compassionately, and you're still able to come out with some sort of confidence. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the person who's in charge. You can be the person behind the scenes, perhaps running the show, but not necessarily the same person actually speaking and communicating, in this case to a national audience.
Because, for instance, the remarks he made, of course, I think he has taken them back and apologized, that there was an insignificant number of people left in there. I mean, really, to say that it's live television, yes, it's happening all, and perhaps he didn't mean to say that, but people hurting, people have lost their loved ones, some don't know where they are, and then there's this government official talking about insignificant numbers. As much as he did not mean to say it, was he the right person to actually be communicating to people?
I think, like you say, he rightly apologized, and we all misspeak.
Yes.
You know, that is human. We all misspeak at times. So those were unfortunate comments, and definitely the cabinet secretary went ahead to apologize. However, I agree with Derrick that perhaps it would have been appropriate to designate a spokesperson with technical know-how on security matters.
Right.
But I also I'm also looking at other crises that we've had in other parts of the world where we have had officials who are not necessarily experts, security experts, but public officials, and you can clearly see that they were prepared. I think the gap that we had was preparation. And this preparation is guided by, I'll hammer this over and over again, an proper counter-terrorism communication strategy that is put in place before a disaster happens. This particular strategy would look at issues like personnel to be involved when a crisis occurs. It would look at processes of collecting and disseminating information, and who is also authorized to be able to disseminate that particular information, and what is the process of preparing them. And above, and you know, beyond just having the strategy in place, because this is a multi-agency operation, it has to be, we have to conduct exercises to ensure that this strategy is working prior. The military conducts exercises before going out on, before being deployed. The same thing needs to be done when you have a strategy in place that brings all these government agencies together. You need to conduct exercises to figure out whether our counterterrorism strategy is working and it's good.
In fact, Sophia, I'll go as far as saying this. Now, this might be a little bit contentious, but if the person who was speaking on behalf of the government, in this case, yes, if this is not your comfort zone, being in the media glare, being able to think fast on your feet, having all these questions thrown at you, I have seen instances, and Paul talked about this, about learning from how other people have covered this. This is not the first time that terrorism has struck anywhere in the world. I've seen people who actually prepare statements, go into a studio or someplace and actually prepare a statement so that you are driving the narrative. You are getting your message out there instead of sort of this reactionary process that I saw a lot in his press briefings, and it almost even defensive when you're being asked questions. Okay, are you about hostages, about mattresses, or any of the things that come up? Prepare a 5-minute narrative, a 5-minute statement, which you can then be aired on all the national stations, where you control the environment and you're able to get your message out, and then you look like you are a little bit more in control of the situation. I don't know if that's something that might have worked in this situation.
Right.
But certainly,
and it would have worked. And also, let's examine the content of what messages were we really expecting. Were we just expecting a fact-relaying session? I don't think so. You know, people were expecting to be assured of their security. When Kenyans were told that everything is in control, we expected people. That's a soundbite that anybody would, any official would use. We expected them to go into a bit of specifics that fit within security parameters, expected security parameters. We expected, for example, minister or whichever official to tell us, we have increased surveillance, we have increased patrols, we have increased security outside the malls. Don't necessarily give us the numbers, but get into a bit more specifics.
Right. And then, yes.
Also on a key message that needed to go out was to the victims.
Right.
I feel that we left out the victims at some point. We seemed to have moved on. We needed the president did really well, but the officials who are giving us briefs at various intervals should have.
Yes. And in fact, there was
talked about the victims a lot more, should have comforted the victims a lot more, should have given messages to assure the victims that your loved ones might still be missing, but we're doing A, B, C, D. It was not appropriate to see or read the name of a victim, of a family or loved one through social media before getting that information from a public official.
And Sophia, sorry, just to wrap this up, there was one more audience that he needed to be speaking to, and that was the terrorists themselves. How about sending them a message and saying, we're going to hunt you down, you're not escaping. These guys are posting tweets, they're posting videos, they're boasting about how they've achieved this great thing. How about talking to them and say, you are not going to escape? I mean, it really needed it to be a nuanced performance, and unfortunately, he fell short on that.
Yeah. And I remember the president actually did say that on the
president
first
did
day.
say on that, yes.
We'll hunt you down, we'll cut you, and we'll punish you. Very strong words he used. And I know you're also in an image consultant, and a picture that has stuck also many Kenyans' minds was when they stood for one of the press briefings near the Westgate Peponi Road, where they were speaking from, and Lenku was there in front addressing the press, and behind him were these other security chiefs, and some of them were dressed in caps, very casually. For such a situation, when we just saw looking at them, did it inspire confidence? And these guys who are just having a weekend, and then somebody called them, come, hey, let's do this press brief. What did that communicate?
Sophia, absolutely right. We are visual creatures. We take a lot of our communication by what we see. We need to see somebody who portrays that confidence, who portrays that credibility, who portrays that compassion. And it was lacking, I think, as you pointed out, certainly in terms of visually. I wanted to see a crisp-looking general out there, you know, dressed to the nines, perhaps in his military gear, really showing people that we're taking this event, this crisis, seriously. I think they certainly needed to work a little bit in terms of their visual presentation, perhaps looking a little bit more official, a little bit crisper. Now I understand, and I'm not going down the road where I expect somebody to show up in a three-piece suit for this kind of a briefing. But visually, we're taking our clues. We look at people, we're reading, and not just how they're dressed, but even their body language. We're reading how they're standing. We're looking at the non-verbal communication in the eyes. Do you look like a deer caught in the headlights? I saw a lot of that. Or you're looking at somebody who has this steely resolve, who's saying, you know what, we're on top of this crisis, we're going to handle it. As I said, giving this sort of press briefings, it's a nuanced performance. Everything is being taken by all these different audiences. You have the victims looking at you, you have the general public, you have all these people who are looking at you, and you've got to be on top of the situation.
Right. Your take?
I agree. I mean, some of those people standing behind the officials didn't need to be there. Or it seemed as though they were not even aware that cameras were rolling for some of them. But I think this incident also gave us an opportunity to see the president from a different perspective. I think he played, he wore many hats in this particular crisis. He was quite resolute as a commander-in-chief. He used words that were clear, and he told the terrorists, we will get you and you will pay for what you have done. He was also a comforter-in-chief. He spoke to a nation that was in mourning. And beyond that, he became a unifier-in-chief also, bringing together different people to rally towards the cause of unity and patriotism. I think it brought a different perspective. And yesterday's speech, I think it would be good to mention the president's speech yesterday was it was a speech that he really connected. I think when all is said and done in the history of his presidency, maybe that will be one of the speeches that will be a defining moment of his presidency.
All right. Our time is up. I want to allow you both to give your closing statements. And as you do so, we've looked at this and clearly we all agree some huge failures, some flops, some mistakes were made. And going forward, we don't know what will happen in the future. Of course, we always hope and hope for the best, but also, as you have been talking over and saying over and over again, preparation is very key for whatever could happen. So going forward, what mistakes must the government, even Kenyans, learn from this? But mostly the government when it comes to communicating, that in the case of a crisis, a tragedy, something of this magnitude, how do you communicate? You've been talking about the counterterrorism communication strategy. I think that's very important to actually have that planned out way before such a situation unfolds, the same way you have the army and people that have been training for in case we have to go to battle. So for communication in these situations going forward, Derrick, your closing statements, what must they keep in mind? What must be done?
Okay, some of the things you mentioned, training, preparation, not to be caught flat-footed. There is this sense of we're trying to bolt the barn door and the horse has already fled. We need to be seen to be on top of the situation. You know, the Chinese word for crisis involves two characters. One of those characters is crisis, the other character is opportunity. Look at this as an opportunity, and Paul has mentioned this, the president, to define yourself. This is where you stand up and be counted, whether it's as a spokesperson, whether it's the head of that crisis communication. I'll go back to that fateful 9/11 event. As I said, I happened to be there. Rudy Giuliani, in handling that crisis, went on to become Time magazine's Man of the Year. We need to be able to find out our true heroes who will stand up in a time of crisis. That's what I'm looking for. God forbid should we go through this terrible situation again.
Thank you.
I would say we continue praying, we get on our knees, but after getting on our knees, we get to work. And getting to work would involve putting together a good, clear counterterrorism strategy that will clearly spell out the processes that need to be followed in terms of a crisis, the personnel that need to be involved, and the methods that we will need to employ in dealing with a crisis coming up in future.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining us this morning, for breaking it down and helping us have an understanding and perspective of especially what needs to be done going forward, because it's not enough to look back and say, oh yeah, that happened and that didn't happen. But most important is now that we are done, going forward, what do we do? Thank you very much. Paula Charles, speech coach, Jade Communication, Derrick Banga, MD, Public Image. Thank